Well, good morning. We have yet to dig into the Sermon on the Mount because we've been dancing around it for a while. We're going to start digging in just a little bit this morning, but there are still a few things that we want to talk about before we get too far into it. Just a recap from some of what we talked about last week. We discussed a little bit last week about the audience. To whom was the Sermon on the Mount truly given? What do you remember about that? Okay. The disciples. Now, some people believe that meant the 12. Other people really think that means those who would listen, those who chose at that time to be disciples of Jesus, learners, followers. Could be more than 12, but it probably was not the entire crowd. Remember, it does talk about the crowd hearing him speak and how they were amazed. But we talked a little bit last week about how the message itself was not necessarily intended for the crowd. It was intended for learners, those who would hear and put into action. Okay. So we talked a little bit about that last week. We also talked about some bookends. We talked about Matthew chapter 4 in verse 23, where Matthew says Jesus taught, he preached, and he healed. He also says the same thing in Matthew chapter 9, and I talked about that possibly being a set of bookends that it encloses this whole idea. We see in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus teaching and preaching, and Matthew 8 and 9, his healing. So those bookends encompass what Matthew intends his message to be. That Jesus came preaching about the kingdom, teaching about the laws and practices, and healing to show evidence and power of the kingdom. Now, there are other people that break down, if you read Matthew or scholars talking about Matthew, there are a lot of different ways that people choose to break down the book. And one of the most popular is that it's broken down into 5 sections. Sometimes that works for me in my head, but in other times I look at those 5 sections and they don't exactly align just right. So I think it's sometimes a mistake to put firm outline to a book. It's possible that Matthew approached his narrative with a specific outline in mind, but sometimes we reading back into it, we will apply something that was not intended the first place. Okay, so just to let you know, there are other ways of addressing how the structure of the book, how the book is structured, how we know when one section starts and ends and another section starts and ends. But last week we did talk about this idea of bookends, and we used those 2 passages as the bookends for this section. We talked about the meaning of Beatitudes. Remember? We talked about how the word Beatitudes it stems from the Latin word that is used. It means happy. But really we talked about the Greek word, and if you really dig into it, the Hebrew word, is not really one that is happy. It really is more of, it's not an emotion at all. It's more of an estimate, an assignment. We talked about it meaning, I used the word fortunate, that you were assigned the estimate of you were fortunate if this is true in your life. And then we talked about maybe that wasn't the best word for everybody because everybody hears words differently. I ran across another explanation and I like it. This other explanation by one scholar says it really means congratulations to. Congratulations to. Because you are gifted with something. You are given a fortune, not by luck, but given a fortune. You are not congratulations you've earned, but congratulations you have been gifted. And so if we were reading the Beatitudes with that in mind, we might say, congratulations to the pure in heart, or congratulations to the poor in spirit. So we talked about this word beatitude and what it might mean. And there is an element of peace and comfort that you might have in your life today, knowing that there will be a gift given to you later. Okay? But the beatitude itself, the teaching itself, does not promise that peace in life today. Do you get that part? It's not a promise of peace here and now. It's congratulations for those who are in this condition, because there is a future gift that will be given. And so we see that pattern throughout the Beatitudes as it goes through. But there's a distinction. There's one little thing. And I said before we left last week, I said, look for another bookend. Another set of bookends. Did anybody do that? Did anybody read through it thinking, bookends? Let me look for the bookends in the Beatitudes. No? Good, I get to talk about it. There are some bookends in the Beatitudes, and those bookends do address, I believe, the here and now. So I just said the gift is a future gift, but the bookends talk about the here and now. Okay, so we'll get to that. Just a little bit of nugget I throw out there. You can chew on the chocolate before we get to the center of the Tootsie Pop. Okay, I do want to address one thing though. Beatitudes, or the idea of sayings that start with blessed are, blessed is, what we know of as a beatitude, was not new. Jesus did not bring this as a new way of teaching. We see this concept of beatitudes throughout the entire Old Testament, very much so in the Psalms and Proverbs. And I've written a few of them up here. This certainly is not comprehensive, but there are a few of the same types of poetry, the same types of teachings, the same types of ideas throughout the Old Testament. If you want to, let's read Psalms 1:1. It was the one that immediately jumped to my mind when I thought about, hey, where do these appear in the Old Testament? If we go to Psalm 1:1, and most of you probably already have this memorized. I had it memorized at one time, but I think I memorized the King James Version, and I don't read that anymore, so it's lost to me. This is how mine says it. This is the NIV. Blessed is, wait a minute, where have we heard that word before? Okay. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked. Now, I think a lot of versions may say walk in the counsel of the ungodly or the wicked. Or stand in the way of the sinners, or sit in the company of mockers. But, now here's the converse statement. This is the contrasting statement. But whose delight is in the law of the Lord. Now, I like some of the older versions because they say, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. And this, to extend that, who meditates on his law day and night. So we see this idea of parallelism. Remember we talked about poetry, Hebrew poetry, and how a lot of poetry has this concept of parallelism. It has a statement, and then usually just one, but sometimes more, a second statement that either reiterates the first statement, restates it for some sort of emphasis, or it will explain the first statement. That's what we see in the Beatitudes in Matthew. Or it will contrast the first statement. It will give the opposite view. So there is a form of Hebrew poetry called parallelism that we see throughout the Old Testament, especially the Psalms and Proverbs. And Jesus is using that same idea, that same poetry in the Beatitudes in his sermon. We're going to look in Matthew 5 at this idea of explaining. And we saw in Psalm 1:1 the idea of contrasting. Because the first statement was, blessed is the one who does not walk in the way of the ungodly. But, contrasting to that, his delight is in the law of the Lord. Okay? One could say it's also explaining why they're blessed because his delight is in the law of the Lord. But I would call that one more a contrasting one. Let's skip down to Proverbs 8:34. There's other verses there you could look at if you'd like, but let's go over to Proverbs chapter 8, verse 34. This one says, "Blessed are those who listen to me, watching daily at my doors and waiting at my doorway." Now, I actually like the way the New American Standard reads that one, so I may have Steve read it. But, "Blessed are those who listen to me, watching daily at my doors, waiting at my doorway, for those who find me find life and receive favor from the Lord." Now, that kind of beatitude or parallelism is a restatement or an explaining. So it's extending the first phrase. Steve, do you want to read that? Because I actually like the way that reads.
Very close, but blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at my doorposts. For he who finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord.
Awesome. Awesome. Waiting at the gate, standing at the doorpost. Again, another form of parallelism and another form of beatitude. Blessed is, fortunate is, congratulations to this kind of person. And then let's look at the last one, Proverbs 28:14. I'm just trying to show that this is not a new thing, especially for Hebrew audience. The Hebrew audience will already know this kind of teaching and these kind of statements. 28:14. "Blessed is the one who always trembles before God." And now we have the contrast. "But whoever hardens their heart falls into trouble." Okay? Blessed is the one, congratulations to the one who trembles before God. But, on the opposite view, whoever hardens their heart falls into trouble. Okay? This is the kind of teaching that is used throughout the Hebrew history. And so we see this kind of teaching brought to the table by Jesus in the Beatitudes. All right. So bookends. If we read the Beatitudes. Now, how many Beatitudes are there? I used to think there were 9. But I really think there are 8. 8 that carry the same poetic form. That last one where Jesus says blessed, I think is totally different. Okay? So I don't think it's really listed among the Beatitudes in that same way. Certainly it is a blessing, a congratulations to statement, but is not used in the same way. But if we look at the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, we see the first one and what I believe is the last one, or the last packaged one, I should say, have 2 things that are the same. The first thing that is the same is the gift. Okay? If you read the first one, this is verse 3, Matthew 5. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And you read verse 10, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The gift is the same. Okay? I think that's, you don't want to make a really big deal about that, but I think it's important because I think it's the beginning and the ending is a package. And again, it's a bookend that says, okay, this is the idea, and then he gives the statements that affirm that idea, and then he closes it with, this is the idea. So, this is my teaching. Now, there's another reason he does that. And it's done throughout the Bible in lots of different places. It makes it easier to remember. When you start with something, and then you tell them the guts, and then you end with the same thing, it makes it easy to remember. And remember, this is an oral environment. People do not have books like we do today. Yes, there were books, there were scrolls, but they were not readily available. So the people hearing this had to remember what Jesus said and take it home. Okay? Okay? They didn't have notebooks to write it down. And so this is a way to package a teaching to make it easier to remember. It chunks it out. Now there's one other thing that is similar about those two Beatitudes that's different from the others. And I want to make a point about this because of what I said earlier today. Notice it says, "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now what do all the others say? If you will be. It talks future. All of the other Beatitudes talk about a future blessing, a future gift. These two bookends talk about a present gift. And what was the main thrust of Jesus' teaching? The kingdom of heaven is near. So let me tell you about the kind of person whose is the kingdom. Okay? I think the kingdom was at that time, is today, and will always be. Okay? It's not a future gift. It's a present gift. We have access to the kingdom today. Now, will we be able to experience the greater glory of the kingdom later? I think so. But that doesn't exclude us from being a part of the kingdom today. So I think it's important. I think it was a trigger that they understood probably more readily than we do today. They were looking for this kingdom. They were ready for this kingdom. And Jesus says, yours is the kingdom. So I think that there's something to be said there. Again, don't feel like you have to make a big deal out of that. But I think there's something to be said about how he uses that present tense versus future tense. Okay? Now, there was a lot of discussion among Jesus' listeners throughout his ministry about Jesus and the law. There were a lot of people that heard his teaching and assumed that he was setting aside the law to create a new mechanism of salvation. Okay? Jesus talks about this in just a little bit inside the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks about the law and how he did not come to set aside the law or to do away with the law. But he came to fulfill the law. So let's talk just a minute about the law, because it is the law that sets us down at the very doorstep of the Beatitudes. Okay? If you understand the law the way it was meant to be used, it puts us at the first Beatitude. So let me ask you, what was the purpose of the Old Testament law? God's intention for the Old Testament law? Guidelines. It was not the means of salvation, right? But it was the guidelines for their living. Why did they need those guidelines? They messed up. They did mess up all the time, but even more than that. Go ahead, Steve.
The natural human thing is to believe that if we try hard enough, we can achieve it on our own. The law was there in part to show them it can't be done.
Exactly. The law was to expose our inability to, one of the things it did was expose our inability to achieve salvation, to achieve full status of righteousness with God. Because anyone who attempts to follow every attribute of the law knows that they mess up. And then when you messed up inside the law, what did you have to do? Offer sacrifices. all the time, continually, okay, to cover those mistakes. But that sacrifice was really just kind of an extension of grace. It was not meant to redeem. Okay? But another thing about the law, I want to go back to what was said about the guidelines and messing up a lot. If they didn't have the law, and a lot of times they ignored the law, what did they begin to look like? The rest of the world. And the rest of the world didn't have a relationship with Yahweh, our God, the Creator God. So the law, in essence, and if you remember the lesson this morning that Greg taught, he talked about guardrails. And the law served as guardrails. God knew they were going to mess up. And if you let a human being go their way far enough, long enough, they won't be anywhere near where they need to be when the Messiah hits the world stage. So the law served as guardrails to keep God's people at least ping-ponging around within the scope or these parameters. So that when Jesus hits the world stage, there's something for Matthew to even reference. Hey guys, remember the law? This is the fulfillment of it. If the law didn't exist, why would we care about Jesus? Okay, so that's the nature of the law. Awesome thing. But it was only there to kind of keep us going down the road in a more or less straight fashion. And it drops us off. The end of that road drops us off at Matthew 5, verse 3. Because, as Steve said, that law tells us that we can't do it on our own. Okay? And we can't do it on our own sets us down at blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean? Blessed are the poor in spirit.
Poverty of spirit indicates genuine repentance.
Okay. I think that's almost stepping into the next one, but I like it. The poor in spirit is a picture of a person who knows their own spiritual poverty. They understand that, spiritually speaking, they have nothing to offer God. It's not of their own making that they can be saved. Now, this idea of poor, Luke doesn't say in spirit, he says poor. But this idea of poor was well used at that time, and it gave the idea of a spiritual poor. It actually gave the idea of a pious person. Not pious as in my nose is in the air because I'm so good. Pious as in I recognize and want God. And this word poor was generally used at that time to mean that. And we see throughout Jesus' teaching talks about the poor and the rich. And we have many people throughout time then that think they've got to take a vow of poverty in order to be godly. Financially poor does not equate to godly. Yeah.
I thought the Jewish people were, with the law, they were always checking off the boxes.
Yes.
Hey, I'm more godly, or I'm more godly than you.
Yes.
All these boxes checked off. I'm confused. How did they, during a certain amount, when
Right. And I think at this point, Jesus was not teaching to the religious folks. He was teaching to the common folks. And I think they're probably at that time, and you know, I don't know, I wasn't there, I can't be certain of this, but I think the people who were hearing him, remember who he's talking to, people who want to learn, they were not the high religious segment. And so they're excited to have a different view. I think the Pharisees at the time, and remember, he's teaching in the rural parts of the country, and that was the domain of the Pharisees. He was not teaching in the temple yet. That was the domain of the Sadducees. So the Pharisees who had an opportunity to hear him probably were they weren't sure where to stand. Because they understood the law, the traditions, the oral law, and the traditions built on that. But a new rabbi comes to town, let's hear what he has to say. And they invited, my dad was a full-time minister. And we never missed a Sunday, even if we were on vacation. We'd go to some off-the-way church, and often they found out he was a minister, they would invite him to preach that day. Oh, you're a minister? Would you like to give the sermon? That's why he taught Balaam so often. No, I'm kidding. No. But it is. I mean, if you have one ready, if you're put into that situation, you always want to have one or two or three ready. And so, yes, he did teach a lot of the same sermons because he was put in situations where he needed a ready sermon. So Jesus would go from town to town to town to town, and what did they do? Oh, you're a rabbi. Would you like to sit in the Moses seat and teach today? And so there was some regard for him even at that time. And I think it was an item of interest. When he gave them, blessed are the poor in spirit, I think there was the tendency to be a checklist salvation people, just like we have today. We have a big tendency today to be checklist salvation people because it's easier. It's easier to have just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, done it. Oop, missed that. Oop, better go fix that. And I think a lot of that is why we have the Sermon on the Mount. Because as we move into the next sections, clarifications on the heart of the law, Jesus will be kind of taking away that checklist and saying, you got it wrong. That idea is wrong. Because it's not about the list, it's about the heart of the law and the list. Okay, so it's a good question, and I danced around it. I'm not sure if I truly am able to respond, but absolutely it's a good question. So Jesus starts where the law drops us off and says, the law tells you you're not good enough. And Paul discusses that at length in Romans. Right? Okay? The writer of Hebrews discusses that. The law teaches you're not good enough, and congratulations to the people who recognize that. That's the first verse. Congratulations to the poor in spirit, to those who recognize that they are spiritually bankrupt. For theirs is the kingdom. Now this probably got quite a bit of attention because it did contrast with the teaching of the day. In fact, let's go, speaking of teaching of the day, to Luke 18. Luke 18, Jesus is telling us a story that really exemplifies this. Luke 18, verse 9. It starts, and it's the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector going into the temple. Now, a Pharisee is one of the recognized leaders. A tax collector, or or I should say publican, I think some of the versions use, was culturally recognized as the bad guy. We talked about this when we talked about Matthew and tax collectors. So here, Jesus is setting up a story that contrasts what was perceived to be the good guy and the bad guy. Pharisee, ooh! Tax collector, ooh, shame, shame, shame. Bad guy. And what does he say? Verse 10, actually. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee, and the other, a tax collector. Now the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like that tax collector over there. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. Poor in spirit? Probably not. Proud of himself. Absolutely. He's being in the traditional pious, our understanding of pious. He's proud of himself, and he thinks these things are what's going to get him to heaven, or what's going to be satisfying to God. Now, flip side, the tax collector stood at a distance. Okay, now what that means, the Pharisee stood by himself, means he stepped forward. He made a show of it. Place of prominence. Now, the tax collector stood at a distance. That doesn't mean way over there. It means I'm keeping at a distance. I'm recognizing an humble state. Okay? Stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now Jesus says, I tell you, this man, rather than that Pharisee, went home justified before God. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That's what the first beatitude means. To be humble. To recognize all of the stuff that I do in the name of religion gets me nowhere. Okay? And so we have to remember that today, don't we? Because we can preoccupy ourselves with a lot of very good things. Church things. We can volunteer here. We could volunteer there. We could teach here. We could preach there. But that, the doing of those things, could totally get in the way of our heart and the recognized dependence that we have on God, on Jesus. Because it's not the things that we do that's going to get us there. Great things. They're good things. Unless you start counting on them. If you start depending on them to get you in, you're going to be like the Pharisee in the story. Number 2, verse 4. Let me get back over to it. Now, if you recognize your spiritual depravity, if you recognize your spiritual bankruptcy, if you are poor in spirit, verse 4, congratulations to you who mourn. What? Congratulations to the sad? No. Congratulations to the people who are sorry. They're mourning the fact that they have nothing to offer God. The fact that they sin continuously. That's the mourning that Jesus is talking about. And a lot of people do teach these Beatitudes as compounding one another, that one leads to the next, leads to the next, to the next. And we see that here. If you're poor in spirit, you will likely be sorry or mourning. Remember that tax collector. Lord, be merciful to me. I'm sorry. I'm a sinner. And I liked, in Greg's lesson today, he talked about confession. In a lot of ways, mourning is confessing. Okay? You have acknowledgement, but just because you acknowledge it doesn't mean you're sorry for it. There are lots of people that say, yeah, I sin all the time. Woohoo! It's fun. That's not mourning. I sin all the time. And I hate it. I'm sorry. Confessing. I think people who are true blue do confess all the time. And not only to God, but also to each other. Okay? Yes. Yeah. I have a couple of verses. One of the ways that we mourn is for our own sin and our own condition. But we see a lot of mourning and examples of mourning in the Old Testament, not just for our own condition, but for the condition of our nation or our people. And Jeremiah, all of Lamentations, was a document of mourning about his people. In Isaiah, we see the same thing. Isaiah 61, we see Ezra mourning for the condition of the people. Coming back from Babylon, Ezra mourns for the condition of the Israelites. And I think in some sense, I think primarily mourning is about me and my personal lack of anything to offer God. But I think there's an element of it that's also saying, I'm sorry that we as a nation or we as a city or we as a church behave the way we behave. I wish there was something we could do about it. You know, that attitude. Okay? Now, what's the promise? That they will be comforted. This idea is actually throughout the Old Testament. Brings comfort. Those who mourn will be comforted. You see this in the Old Testament. Let's see if I wrote some of these down. That might be... Bear with me a sec. Okay, let's go to the Isaiah 61 verse. Isaiah 61, verse 1. Isaiah 61, verse 1. God tells Isaiah to bring this message, and he says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news," here's our word again, "to the poor." Now, that's not financially poor, although sometimes it's easier for the poor to acknowledge God and look for God, right? Right? It's harder if you're rich to focus on God. We'll get to that in Jesus' teaching later, because Jesus does teach on that. But this is the Spirit's good news to the poor. That is the people who seek God and realize that they're not in a position where they can have that relationship with God. God has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, those who mourn, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from the darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. So the idea of bringing comfort to those who mourn is not a new one. It was something they sought. Another interesting thing, this where is it? Day of vengeance of our God. Was that a good thing? Day of vengeance. We often see the Israelites looking forward to the day of vengeance. I think because they misunderstood it. They felt it was vengeance against their enemies. Vengeance against the people outside. Exactly. Revenge against anyone anti-Israel. But what it really was is God's day of judgment. God's day of judgment. And judgment on Israel. You know, when Jesus taught the kingdom is at hand, when John the Baptist taught the kingdom is at hand, what was their message? Get your path straight. Why? Because the day of vengeance ain't going to be fun. What about us today? It's not fun. We need to consider that. When we pray for the day of the Lord, the Lord's coming. What are we praying for? Are we ready for the judgment that's indicated? Okay? All right. I'm just looking at the time. This next one, the meek. There's all kind of fascinating things about this one. We could talk probably for 30 minutes about it, so I'll try to consolidate it down to 5. But we'll see. Verse 5, Matthew. Get back to it. Oh, I lost my place. My bookmark fell out. I better put that back. Verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. What does meek mean? Gentle. Humble? Yes. You know where it comes from? The Greek word? It's the idea of a bridled horse. A wild horse has all kinds of strength. A bridled horse still has all kinds of strength, but it is a horse under control. It is a horse, a broken horse, that has allowed itself to be under control. That's the idea of meek. It is not weak. It is not uncourageous or wimpy. It's, I am no longer in control. Regardless of how able I am giving all of my strength, all of everything that I might have to offer to God's control. So let's follow the pattern. Blessed are the poor in spirit. I recognize, spiritually speaking, I have nothing that can get me there. Blessed are they who mourn. I'm sorry that I have that condition. I'm sorry that I have sin in my life. I really am contrite about that. Blessed are the meek. Because I have nothing of my own to offer, and because I'm sorry for that, here you go, God. Here's my life. Do with me what you see best. I will use my energies, I will use my strengths to your glory for your purposes. Now, it's a very precarious balance. Because remember what I said a while ago, we could find ourselves in so many very good activities for God that we lose our focus and the heart of the matter. Right? We could be so busy doing the things that we think God needs us to do in service for Him that we forget that it's not about the doing those things. We could end up patting ourselves on the back, whether or not we think we are or not. I think that's we deceive ourselves a lot. Yeah, and I think the Pharisees and the Sadducees did the same thing. They thought they were doing right. Some of them. Okay. So, blessed are the meek. Let me read right quick Proverbs, verse 16. Proverbs 16. Let me get there. Was there a question we needed to address?
You want to know how many people were there that were selling on the mail?
A lot. A lot. How many people were there listening? We don't know. We know His disciples. How many were there? How many of His disciples were there? Were they just the 12? Probably more than that. There were probably hundreds of disciples. But then it also says there were crowds. So there likely were as many as thousands listening to Him. But there weren't thousands that were devoted to Him. They weren't learners. They were just people who were like, I want to go hear this speaker and see what he has to say. Now, they may have become disciples because of that, or they may have walked away and said, that was an interesting lesson. So we don't know how many necessarily in this case. So where were Proverbs? We were going. Proverbs 16 is where I was headed. Proverbs 16 is just a proverb that talks through or mentions this idea of strength under control. Verse 32. Okay. Better, this is 32 of chapter 16. Better a patient person than a warrior. One with self-control than one who takes a city. Is a warrior wrong? Depends on the context. But what the proverb is about self-control. There are people with great power that don't know how to control that power. And we see that not just in the force of mass, but we see that in political power. We see that in all kinds of contexts of power. Just because you have power doesn't mean you use it correctly. And so this is talking about self-control. In Jesus' perspective, it's talking about letting God control you. That's not what the proverb says, but there's where Jesus is headed. Who is the meekest person to ever walk the earth? Okay, I would say that, but let's go to Numbers. Numbers 12, verse 3. You have to look at this. It's kind of funny. Numbers 12, verse 3. Now, Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. You know what's funny about that? Right. I'm sorry. You're right. Christ wasn't in the picture yet. He said a lot of things. He didn't use self-control. Well, you're right. There was a time when Moses did not use self-control. This is what a lot of people say is funny about this. Who wrote the book of Numbers? Well, God, through Moses. Yeah. And so a lot of people say, well, of course, Moses is going to say that. Now, what do I think? Honestly, I think Joshua wrote it. Moses may have told him what to write. And you notice this part, in my Bible anyway, is in parentheses. Okay? So I don't doubt that Joshua put that in here because he's sitting there day after day after day seeing what Moses is having to deal with. And so he's like, oh man, I need to write this in. Poor Moses. Man, he is humble. He deals with all this junk. And he doesn't get upset. Of course he does, but I'm just seeing this in my head as a perspective of Joshua writing this down. Okay?
But that's on further down in his life when this is being written about his life too. It's not back there.
Correct. We technically don't know the date this was written, but we do know, like Deuteronomy is one of the books of Moses, but supposedly, and the giving of the Deuteronomy, the second law, Moses wasn't around. So, at what point was it truly written? We don't know. It's just funny. It's just funny that it's a book of Moses, and it says Moses was the most humble, or the old versions say meekest person on the earth. Now, it was said, Jesus. Let's go to that. If we were to look at Matthew 11:29, let me make sure I'm going to the right place. Not quite the right place, but we'll go ahead and, since I'm already here. Jesus himself says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I, Jesus, am gentle and humble in heart. I am meek," he says, "and you will find rest for your souls." Okay, let's talk about Jesus. What did he go through? Matthew 26. Matthew 26, verse 53. Now, Jesus was in the garden, and the temple guard comes to arrest him. And Peter pulls out his sword and says, "Not today." Now, Jesus says, wait a minute. Put your sword back. And here's what he says. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? We have a song, don't we? He could have called 10,000 angels. If he had wanted to, he had all the power in the world. And yet, he didn't. Right, when he was tempted? Right. So, Jesus, though extremely powerful, and he could have gotten himself out of the immediate problem, put himself under God's control, under the situation, put himself at God's disposal so that the will of God could be fulfilled. If you were to read Isaiah, a lot of Isaiah, and I've got certain verses, but if you read a lot of Isaiah, it talks about how he gave up his own control for us, for me. He was meek in that he allowed himself, though with all power, he allowed himself to be put to death. To, I'm going to say, seemingly be defeated by Satan. knowing the full purpose and will and power of God. Okay? It wasn't about the moment. It was about the final purpose and the final ability of God. And so that's really where this is headed with the meek. And they shall inherit the earth. What on earth? The actual word says land. They will inherit the land. Now, you will see in Luke, if you see the same beatitude, it doesn't say that per se. That was a phrase that the Hebrew people would recognize. Why? What was Abraham promised? The land. And the Israelites always looked for the land, inheriting the land, inheriting the earth. Remember, I have said for a long time, God is jealous about His land. Okay? So that was an important phrase to Matthew's audience. Wasn't necessarily important to Luke's audience. But that was a phrase that Jesus would say to the people who were listening, and they would understand it. It's those people, the meek, the poor in spirit, the ones who mourn, that inherit the land. Wait a minute. I'm an Israeli. I'm a Jew. I know that phrase. He's telling me something totally new. Doesn't contradict the law, but it is something new. I can inherit the land by being that? Because that Jewish rabbi over there, that Pharisee over there says, I'm a nobody. But I can inherit the land? I can be God's people? Awesome. Okay, we're out of time. I really kind of wanted to get through the next one, but that's okay. Look, if you want homework, look through the Beatitudes and see if there's a shift in perspective. Look for the shift in perspective. And we'll talk about it next week. We'll pick up next week with hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And then we'll also talk about shifting our perspective and looking another direction as we pursue further Beatitudes. And I don't think there's anything else I need to say today. So if you don't mind, pray with me. Lord, thank you so much for your wisdom and your words. Thank you for the opportunity we have to study your words. May we open our hearts and our minds and accept them and hear them, not just landing on our ears, but landing in our hearts, understand them and apply them. Help us to be your lights as we walk out these doors. Thank you, Father, for Jesus. Thank you for the gift of salvation, that we may be blessed, that we may be congratulated, not because of our own abilities, but because of who you are and who Jesus was. Thank you, Father, for that gift. It's through Jesus we pray. Amen.